Welcome. This is the second night of Boys in the Boat, the rest of the story with Jim Pocock. We're very pleased to have him here tonight. My name is John Thornell. I'm the girls head coach at Stonington Crew. For those that don't know, it's a public high school rowing program on the Mystic River. And I'm also the director of rowing for Stonington Community Rowing. So those nice signs you saw on the front coming in, that's our project. We're a group of volunteers of crew parents, former rowers, coaches, and we're raising $2.5 million to build that boathouse and to build on what we have already with the public high school rowing team to make rowing available to others in our community. That could be other high school students, it could be middle school students, it could be adults as well, from Stonington, Mystic, and neighboring towns. So we're really excited about promoting the sport and making the sport available. Part of the reason we're doing this tonight is to promote the sport of rowing. It's something that we found valuable in our lives, and we want to share that with other people as well. A very special thank you. Oh, and by the way, I'll be outside. We do have a movie coming in, so we need to finish by 7:30. So we'll take Q&A outside. I'll be out front with the signs if you want to ask questions or learn more about that project. And Jim will also be outside after his presentation to do the same. So we'll just be right outside. Very special thank you to the United Theater. They've been a pleasure to work with tonight, or with the two nights we've had. The interest was just beyond our expectations. You don't know this, but we were supposed to be in another room. They gave us this big, beautiful theater, so we're here now. And they also gave us a second night, so we've done this for 2 nights. That said, if you know someone who couldn't make it tonight or any of the nights, we are recording tonight. So everybody has to be on their best behavior. But we are recording tonight, and that will be up on stoningtoncommunityrowing.org for others that want to watch it. So it's been a pleasure working with you folks at the United, and we have more in store. We'll have some other activities down the road. And thank you also to Fourth Henry for filming this. He's the crew team. He's one of our sponsors for the crew team. Did a phenomenal. If you go to stoningtoncrew.org, did a really, really sharp video last spring of a practice. It's just a beautiful drone footage overhead and kids in the boats, and it's fantastic. And then finally, we'd like to thank Mr. Pocock for coming. He's north of Boston. He came all the way down here to spend 2 nights with us. So we're very, very lucky to have him tonight. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, John. Thank you. Pleasure to be here, and great to see all you folks. And I sure appreciate the hosting of Stonington Community Rowing. John told you what they're trying to do, and I had a good talk with him yesterday and today about this. I'm impressed with what they're doing at Stonington. You know, building that boathouse, and so John is raising money. He's doing a great job on this. I'm also a fundraiser. I got a nonprofit that I'm doing, so I'm familiar with that. So I want to do what he was not bold enough to do. Please give him some money. So, you know, if you've got philanthropy to do, what better thing to put it into? So talk to John about that. Help him get over the top. All right, so I have a famous rowing name now, Pocock. I always used to have the kind of name I had to pronounce twice and spell for people, but now everybody knows my name, everybody, at least in the rowing community. So I'm 5 generations ahead of me. We're boat builders. George Pocock is my great uncle. My grandfather, Dick Pocock, spent a 42-year career building racing shells for Yale University, and that's the side of the family that I was born into. So I got a lot of Pocock stories, many more than I can tell you between now and 7:30. So, how many of you have read the book? All right, that's a lot. Here it is. How many have seen the movie? Okay. I could spend quite a bit of time talking about the differences between the book and the movie. Bill Miller, rowing historian, a famous coach, he and I compiled a list of 10 differences. So, but you can ask me out in the hall. This is the end of the race, right? And you see the good guys win at the top by 0.6 of a second. And so I'm honoring them. I got my UW sweatshirt on. I was at the head of the Charles this year, and UW had a nice tent, and I said, where'd you all get those sweatshirts? And I got handed one, so figured I'd wear it tonight. Okay, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to play a video here. This is a trailer for Daniel James Brown's website for the book. And this is going to be interesting because the last bit of it has Lenny Riefenstahl's original video made in 1936 of the actual race and the finish of the race with the call. So it's part of her original movie.
In 1936, as the Nazis prepared to stage the Summer Olympics in Germany, 9 working-class boys in the American Northwest nurtured an impossible dream.
They came out of nowhere, out of logging camps, dairy farms, shipyards, and small dusty towns. But in 1936, in an old shell house at the University of Washington, they found one another, and together they set on an epic saga. Ahead of them lay the prospect of Olympic gold. They crushed the 2-time Olympic champions at the University of California. They beat the best crews in the East, the well-heeled sons of bankers and lawyers and corporate titans. They took on rowing's elite aristocratic British boys from Oxford and Cambridge and smashed the world's record to win the right to row for gold. Then, in Berlin, the heart of the new Nazi state, the stage was set. On a nearby balcony, Adolf Hitler stood watching. Out on the water, his German boys wore swastikas on their chests. The crowd, 75,000 strong, began to chant Deutschland, 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 and the flag was dropped.
Daneben mit weißem Stirntuch die Italiener, dahinter die Ungarn, neben diesen England, auf der Außenbahn aber führt Amerika. Deutschland kommt auf, Meter um Meter. Zu spät, zu spät. Amerika hat gesiegt. Erster Amerika, zweiter Italien, dritter Deutschland.
So, you know the movie, they got the wreath thing right. You could see that they did that. That was actually it. And also you saw at the end of at the end of that clip, they didn't have that big photo finish kind of thing that they did in the movie. In fact, Bobby Mock gave an interview. You can actually see it it's on YouTube. It was in 1980. And he talked about the end of the race, and he said it was about 4 or 5 seconds where they didn't really know who won. And then the public announcer said, America. So it took him just that long to find out. Okay, this is George Pocock. This is my great uncle. This is a guy, he died in 1976. I was 22 years old. I knew him. He came east every year. He and his brother, my grandfather, were good, close brothers, and they would gather. They would go to, my dad and mom hosted a Memorial Day picnic every year in May, and George and Francis would come, and they would sit at the picnic table and talk rowing the whole day. So that's what I remember. But George was a very private man, and he didn't actually like having his picture taken. And this was when an interviewer asked him a question that demanded a little thought. And to gather his thoughts, he just looked down the keel of this boat he was building, and the photographer snapped that picture. I think it's a wonderful shot, and that's if you Google George Pocock, this is always the first picture that comes up. I put this in because this is his family. So George is the boy in the back, in the middle. He was born in 1891, and that's my grandfather, taller than he, in the back, and their older sister Lucy in the back, and in the front, this is Aaron Frederick. He went by Fred. This is their dad. And there's not a wife in this picture. These are 5 children, and that's Julie, Auntie Ju, as we called her. She lived in New York City. And Kath. All those kids came to America. And Fred, my great-grandfather, was a boat builder. He built he was what was called a journeyman boat builder, which actually meant what it said. He journeyed up and down the Thames wherever he could find work as a boat builder. His father, especially his wife's father, John Vickers, I'm actually named after him. My name is James Vickers Pocock. And he was a boat builder. He quite famously built a boat that Henry Stanley took with him, a sectional boat, when he was hired by the London Times to go find the missing explorer and missionary David Livingstone in Africa. So that's part of my family history too. And then there was boat builders a generation before that. So there's 5 generations of boat builders going back into the middle of the first half of the 1800s. So that's a family, and they were boat builders. It was a very segmented, class-oriented society in England, and they were working class people, building boats. I'll give you a picture of Lucy here. Lucy has just won a race on the Thames, so she's an English champion, English women's champion. She's 24 years old. Look at how she had a long black skirt she had to race in, and a sweater. The guy helping her out was a coxswain. She had to drag that guy around. So she won, but I just put that in. Lucy was a magnificent, 6 foot tall, tremendous athlete. She followed her brothers to Seattle. She coached the University of Washington women's swimming, and she started a women's crew. So, and she married her husband, James Stillwell, was enamored by her because she had a job as a cook when she first got there for the Washington crew. And she would get in a single scull, built by her brothers with a little cargo area, and she would scull all the way to Pike's Place Market in Seattle, buy provisions, scull back. And this guy watched her every morning and said, "That's a magnificent woman, I must meet her." And so they married, so we got a whole bunch of Stillwells in our family. That's the same race. That shows you how popular rowing was. All right, 26,000 people lined the Thames to watch the women's championship race in London. And there's hundreds of thousands of people that watch. And by the time of this 36 Olympics, that race, the 8-oared shell race, was arguably the most important, it was the most revered event of the entire Olympics. Now we think Jesse Owens and all that, but rowing was huge. And back in those days, when Yale and Harvard would row here on the Thames, there were trains that went up and down filled with people. And same thing in Poughkeepsie. Huge spectator sport. This is on the Thames at Eton. And this is where Richard, my grandfather, Dick, and George learned their craft of building boats. They were apprenticed to their father at about 15 years old. And an apprenticeship lasted about 6 years, where they learned how to become boat builders, and then they became master boat builders when they finished their apprenticeship. And back up the hill behind these buildings was Eton College, which is the prep school for the elite sons of English royalty and English, Great Britain, the whole world Commonwealth. They all sent their prominent sons there. And it was a requirement at Eton College that all the boys could row a single. It was a required sport. And so Fred, my great-grandfather, was hired at one point as a boatmaster there. So he would build shells and maintain, they had hundreds of shells, singles and on up. And my grandfather said at the height of the rowing season in the spring, you could walk across the Thames on singles. So, as I told you, they were, Fred was raising 5 kids, 4 of them all the same mother. Lucy Vickers, my grandfather and George's mother, died shortly after George was born, and then he married a 3rd time. He had 3 wives die on him. And then Kath, the youngest one, was a half-sister. But 5 kids and their working dad. So they moved a lot. They had a series of housekeepers, but they lived for quite a while in where you see that bow window right here on that was their apartment. And it's very interesting. I didn't mention this last night, John. Since the book and the movie's out, and there's quite a bit of buzz here and in England, The English, they're making that the equivalent of what we have here is on the Register of Historic Places. And there's going to be a plaque there, kind of on the side street that goes up where George Pocock lived, where the Pococks lived. So that's pretty cool. It gives my wife and I a chance to get over there and take a picture, I guess. Another shot of the same kind of place. The river was the main artery. These guys born, my grandfather in 1889, George in 1891, turn of the century, before motor cars. It was either horses on the dirt roads or it was livery traffic on the river. So that was the taxi cabs on the river. That was cargo that was hauled by oarsmen. And this is where these guys grew up. They learned how to row from their dad, and they learned how to make boats. But they grew up around these professional oarsmen, and they practiced what they called the Thames waterman's stroke. And both George and Dick would describe it very simply as the maximum efficiency or the maximum effect from the least amount of effort. So, you know, and that's the stroke that they taught. They taught Hiram Conybeare, the coach at Washington, who was not an oarsman, didn't know how to row, but he was the coach of the team. They basically taught him and demonstrated that. And then everybody that learned to row at Washington, we'll get into this a little bit later, basically taught by the Pococks, wound up becoming coaches at most of the prominent schools, including, I was just talking to Carl here. Carl rowed at MIT, and first the coxswain from the 36th crew, Bobby Mock, went to coach at MIT, and then Stub McMillan, also in the boat. And Stub McMillan was Carl's coach. So they learned how to row at Washington, essentially from the Pocock brothers. All right, I put this slide in because this is the same spot, just turned 180 degrees, look across the river at Windsor Castle. It's Windsor on one side, Eton on the other, and a bridge in between. I put this in because it's personal to me. My grandmother grew up about a mile from Windsor Castle in Windsor, and my grandfather and grandmother courted over this bridge. He came as a single man. It took them, he arrived here, my grandfather at 21, George was 20, and I know my grandfather was still not married at 28. I think he married at 29 or 30, so it took all that time to get established. Finally sent for her, she came over, and they married. George, he's either 15 or 17 in this picture. He was taught to row by his dad. All the kids were. His dad entered him into his first race when he was 15, and he won. At 17, his father registered him for a race in Putney on the Thames, a part of the Thames that wasn't their native part. And he told him, I'm going to quote, "Build the boat. No one will ask how long, but they will ask who built it." And so George took a long time, and he built the single. It was a mahogany hull, and it was ash washboards. It was opposite the color pattern that most of the boats were built. It was a very distinguished boat. And there were 58 entries in this race, including the defending English sculling champion. And it was a handicapped race based on how you finished. You get 2-second head starts. So they had elimination heats, came down to the final four. And Charles Harding was the name of the English champion. So two other guys, George was off third, Harding was off fourth, 2 seconds separating them. And his father gave him advice in the final. He said, "Wag Harding knows this course blindfolded. It's his native part of the river. Keep him directly astern and you'll never need to look around where you're going. And if you scull, you know you're going. And you know, a quick look like this over your shoulder, that's 1/10 of a second, right?" So George beat him by about a deck length. And he won 50 pounds in this, 17 years old. He won 50 pounds. And this is like 1909 or something like this. It was tremendous. When he got back to the dock, his father, reserved Englishman, was ecstatic, overjoyed, reached down and hugged him in the boat, almost fell in the river himself. And when they finally got up on the dock, he told him, he said, 2 weeks ago, I bet 5 pounds on you at 20-to-1 odds. That's why his dad was so happy. This is a picture. This is 1936, and after the Olympics, George and Aunt Frances came back through London up to Eton, and George made touch with all his old friends. Many were still there in the boathouse around Eton College, and it was the last time he saw his father alive. But one of his old mates said to him, "George, we still have that single of yours that you built when you were a teenager. It's still up in the racks. Would you like to see it?" "My, would I. Would you like to take it out?" "Would I?" And then he said, "I have no togs." That's what my grandparents always used to call athletic gear, togs. "I have no togs. We'll get you some togs." So it found some shorts and a t-shirt, and George took this, and his wife snapped this photo. George has a, this is memories. This is not published. George Yeoman's Pocock Memories. His family persuaded him 5 years before he died to write down all his memories and his stories, and he did. He spent about as much time describing this row that he had on the Thames as he did describing the final in the gold medal final in Berlin. So it shows you how much, very emotional for him to take that boat out for that final row. Okay. Guy who didn't like his picture taken. This is my grandfather, Dick Pocock. What an oarsman and builder of boats, 6'5", and tremendous sculler. And he is pictured here in his Doggett's coat and badge. The Doggett's race was commissioned in 1714 by Thomas Doggett, who was an actor in London. And as I said, the livery, the taxi cabs were all on the river. And he wanted to find out who the fastest oarsman was. And so he put up the money for this race. It's been raced every single year since 1714. And the war years in World War II, they held it up. But then when the war was over, they got everybody for that year to race. You could race it once in your life, in the year after your apprenticeship, so about 21 years old. And that year, finishing his apprenticeship for my grandfather was 1910. He was 21 years old, and he won this race. And you're given this red coat and uniform and a badge on the arm. The Doggett's coat is owned by the rowing museum, the rowing history here in America. And when the National Rowing Museum was at Mystic Seaport a few years ago, this hung in a display there. It's, since my grandfather's gone, my father is now gone, I guess I own it. But it's in the custody of the Rowing Museum. The badge that you will see when that's finally displayed, the badge is a fake. The real badge is right here. So this now hangs in my living room, and let me read the inscription for you. Pretty cool. The gift of Mr. Thomas Doggett, the late famous comedian, in commemoration of King George's happy accession to the throne of Great Britain, 1714. And then it's inscribed with Richard John Pocock of Eton and the date. So this is a tremendous family treasure for us. And I'll pass it around. You can take a look at it.
Great.
Yeah.
How about that?
I've given this talk a lot of times. I've gone home with it every time. All right. Just a minute on the Doggett's race. It's raced in London in August every single year. And the stipulations of the race, stipulated in 1714, it's like a head race, I mean, you basically follow the course of the river, you go under bridges. The stipulations are normal river traffic is not to be interrupted. So if there's barges, if there's tugboats, whatever is on the river, you just got to get around it. And it's from the starting spot to a certain bridge. And this is the start of the race in his year. This is my great-grandfather, Fred, who for 40 years was the starter. His title was Barge Master of the Company of Fishmongers. So he put on that uniform and got his megaphone, started the race. And that's the Times of London's announcement. And there's the coat in its display case, and hopefully we'll see it. It kind of sat in the attic of my grandparents for a long time and had mothballs, but the rowing people have restored it. They spent a lot of money and fixed it all up, so that's pretty cool. And there's the thing that you're passing around. Okay, here is, we're talking now 1911. Fred had lost his job. He was let go because he was told that he was too kind to the people who worked under him. You know, very class society, and they figured, okay, you're the boss, you're running this crew, you need to be tougher on these people. He wasn't. They got a lot done, and he wasn't too political a guy. So anyway, he lost his position, went up and down the river and tried to get different things. He bought a theater, and it didn't work. And there just wasn't a lot of boat building business. So these two young guys, 21 and 20 years old, who were now full-fledged boat builders, very skilled at their craft. In fact, you know, Eton College, they built boats for Eton College. They were commissioned as teenagers to build boats for the sons of royalty. My grandfather, before he turned 20 years old, built a boat for Anthony Eden, who was a future prime minister of Great Britain. The Crown Prince of Siam became King of Siam. They made a musical about the guy. Tom Sopwith, who founded an airline company, World War I, Sopwith Camel, and Cunard, steamship line. So all of these wealthy families commissioned these two teenagers who built singles for their sons and taught them how to row. So there's stories about that in George's books. Okay, so they determined we don't have a future here. There's just not enough boat building work. We've got to go elsewhere. And they decided they were going to go to Australia because a lot of English and rowing in Australia. And they were just ready to go to London to book passage. And one evening came a caller to their house, a guy named Charlie Young. And they figured that he was coming to kind of court Lucy and maybe trying to get up the courage to propose to Lucy. And George's memoirs state he was fortified with strong drink, okay? So that's Charlie Young. They sat around the small little kitchen table and they're talking about things, and the boys told Charlie Young about their plans to go to Australia. And he said, you know, I've got a cousin who's in Vancouver, British Columbia, making $10 a week sawing logs. And then he left. He never got the courage to go talk to Lucy. And they were debriefing around the table, and somebody said, you know, drunken men often speak the truth. On the basis of that kitchen meeting, they switched their plans and came to North America. They booked passage in London. They went up to Liverpool, sailed on this boat from Liverpool to Halifax. In Halifax, they went into a tent. George talks about the overweight guy sweating profusely sitting in that tent. And in about 3 minutes, they went out the back of the tent, citizens of Canada. And then they got on a train. The train was worse than the boat, going all the way across. It was 15 pounds passage, steerage, about $75. George had winnings. Dick borrowed the money from his father, paid him back. The first night out, everybody else was fed, then the steerage people, and they put out these greasy sausages. And in fact, George says everybody was tucking into them. But these two athletes looked at this thing and said, we're not going to eat those. Those look terrible. And the next day, everybody from steerage was up sick. They were up on the top deck, leaning over the rail, heaving into the ocean. But these guys knew. And they befriended a steward who told them on the last day, 5-day trip, told them on the last day, you know, we do that all the time. First day out, we give the steerage people these greasy sausages and they get sick. We don't have to buy as much food that way. So they knew. Interestingly, you know when that trip was? That was April 1911. You know what ship took that same route April 1912? That was the same route as the Titanic 1 year later, right? So George was also on a top bunk. He was the youngest. He was put up there. He had an I-beam right over his head. He said rats ran up and down all night long. So that's the way they came over. Came to Vancouver. There was no, what are boat builders going to do? They're trying to make connections. They took whatever jobs they could. They had $20 in their pocket, Canadian, at the time. And George wound up going if you know British Columbia and stuff, it gets into the mountains pretty good as you come east and near the border of Alberta. He was up there in one of those long lakes, cutting down this huge timber and kind of running a sawmill up there. He had never used power equipment in his life and was at a table saw and hit a soft piece of wood and ran his hand through the table saw and cut off these two fingers on his right hand, his dominant hand. And it was a tremendous disappointment for him because he was going to go all the way back to London for his Doggett's year in his 21st year and race. But he cut off his fingers, he couldn't do it. And he was healing. A guy that he had regularly beat won the race. So George, it was a great disappointment for him. Eventually, they got, there's a Vancouver rowing club that was already there. If you ever go to Vancouver, go to the Vancouver Rowing Club. There's Cole Harbour is a, prominent, there's a lot of, hotels and stuff on it. But at the point of Cole Harbour, where you go around to Stanley Park, this big urban park, magnificent building, Vancouver Rowing Club. It's, it was well established in 1911 when they got there. And there is a picture of George and Dick Pocock from 1912 hanging in their trophy room. So they figured, okay, here's two English guys. They say they can build boats. They gave them a contract for 2 singles, $200. They had nowhere to work. They said, where can we work? They said, well, we'll sell you this floating shop that we have. So it cost them $100 to buy this shop. And then the rest of the money, kind of buying what tools that they would need, supplies, and the wood. So this is where the first Pocock built boats in America were built, in North America. And it went up and down with the tide. When the tide was down, it was tethered. It had an anchor and it had a chain. That broke once and they drifted out and had to lose a whole day paying somebody to tow them back. But when it would go down, you never knew where it landed. Most of the time it was hard, but sometimes it would get stuck in the mud. And then the tide would come up, the whole thing would tilt because something would be stuck in the mud, water would rush in, they'd climb up to the loft and just sit there and wait until enough tide would rise, and then boom, it would release and the water would rush out, it would raise like a submarine. And this is how these fine woodworkers built single shells inside this thing. But they built the first 2 singles, and Vancouver Rowing Club realized what they had there, so they started getting a lot of work. One day, this guy comes rowing towards them. They look at him, he's rowing a single toward them, and one brother called to the other, come and look at this guy. They thought he was drunk because he was not doing well. The water was rough, but not that rough. And finally they realized he was coming to them. They called, he said yes. They gaffed him in, and he got up and he identified himself as Hiram Conybeare, the rowing coach at the University of Washington in Seattle. My grandfather and his brother were proper Englishmen. They did not, tried not to betray with their looks or whatever they said, what they thought. But Dick engaged Mr. Conybeare in conversation while George went around behind him, tried to smell his breath. And he stood behind him and he wagged his head. No, he's not drunk. I don't smell anything. Maybe he's who he says he is. He told them that they had a rowing program. He was the coach and they had an order for 12 8-oared shells. And they finished up their work, went down to Seattle, checked it out, said, okay, well, we'll come down to Seattle. They sent for their father, who was out of work. And Aaron, Fred, and Lucy came over. When they got to Halifax, they were told by Conybeare, well, I told you 12, but I really only have money for 1. So that Lucy and Fred came anyway. It was actually Fred and Dick, my grandfather, who built the first 8 for the University of Washington while George was finishing up work in Seattle. But they stayed. They, as I mentioned earlier, they basically kind of taught this guy. He was a football coach. He kind of raised his hand when they said, who can coach rowing? And he read books, but they basically taught him. By 1913, they went to Poughkeepsie. This was the finish of the race. This is just, a year and a half into the Pococks. They went in a Pocock boat. They surprised the world by finishing third, close third to Cornell and Syracuse. And everybody on the East thought, what an aberration. But they continued to improve. By 1917, things had slowed down. The rest of the world, US not until 1918, were in World War I in Europe. And the university president brought this guy into their shop and said, Bill, these are the two brothers I told you about. And as George says, Bill, whoever he was, saw this 8 that we had just built, the hull was up, and he got down on his hands and knees and he looked at the workmanship, and then he got up and he said, this is the kind of workmanship I'm looking for. And he gave him his card and he said, come see me as soon as you can. And he left the building and they turned it over and it was W.E. Boeing, airplane manufacturer. So this was this is the fellow that my grandfather always called Bill Boeing. And these two brothers worked for Bill Boeing for 5 years. And he said, when they actually, it was several months, they had some projects to finish up. This is his office. They went and met him here. Boeing people call this the Red Barn. It was the first place Boeing aircraft was. If you go to Seattle, please go to the Museum of Flight. Boeing operates it. It's a little bit south of Seattle. This building is there. It's the largest artifact in the museum. You can go in this building and see it just as it was back here when Boeing was getting going. And Boeing said, I've got a contract for 50 seaplanes, but my problem is the pontoons. They're heavy, they always break, they fill with water. Can you build pontoons? They said, well, show us the plans. And they said, yeah, this looks like a pretty good project. Yeah, we can do this. And he said, how much would they weigh? They said, they calculated 115 pounds. Boeing said, if you can build me 2 of these for 115 pounds, I will buy you each a new hat. 3 days later, they called him to their shop. He called for a scale. One was 116 pounds, the other was 114 pounds. So they hit it. But George in his memoir said, we never got the hats. So I was doing this talk, or a version of this talk, quite a while ago, up in Massachusetts, and a guy came up to me afterwards and said, I've worked my entire career for the Boeing Aircraft Company. I apologize on behalf of the company. And then he found me a week later. He knew where the coffee shop I hung out, and he came and he said, here are 2 hats, and he gave me this hat and another one. So it was, 100 years later. But this hat says, if it's not Boeing, I'm not going. Now, I don't know if they would have the guts to have that same hat today. They're in rough shape. Here's a picture of the pontoon shop. That's my grandfather on the far right. And Boeing said, okay, hire whoever you have to hire, build these pontoons. And they hired 12 guys, set up a whole shop. They had 150 pontoons finished before the first airframe was finished. That was enough for the 50 planes plus 50 spares. And Boeing said to them, what's wrong with my final assembly plant? And he asked George, because George was more of a systems guy than my grandfather Dick. He said, George, would you please go into this and take a look? And George knew nothing about airplanes or flight dynamics, but he knew everything about, putting things together and woodwork. So he went in there and he came back with a report on flaws in the manufacturing process, and they're doing this wrong, and if they change the sequence. At 27 years old, Mr. Boeing made George Pocock foreman of his final assembly plant, and Dick was foreman of the pontoon shop. And in fact, their success with these seaplanes was just tremendous. Boeing actually sent young George Pocock all around to everybody else who was building airplanes in the country to go look in their shop, introduce himself or whatever, and just talk to people and find out what they were doing. And he would always come back with these copious notes and help Boeing improve his business. World War I ended. Boeing's orders for planes went down. He didn't have a whole lot. He had 30 people in his shop. He wanted to keep them all. He thought the future was in airplanes, but there weren't any orders. So the Pococks are on the payroll. They just spent their time building shells. So this 8-oared shell was built in Boeing's final assembly plant. And there was a House committee from Washington, D.C. that was touring all the post-World War I airplane manufacturers in the country to see who would get government contracts. And they came out to Seattle and went into the Boeing's place there. There were no airplanes. There were just some plans for airplanes. The only thing in there was 2 8-oared shells. And the guy, the head of the committee, says, "Who built these?" And Boeing said, "Oh, these 2 fellows who work for us. I want to meet them." So they went and got them. And he said, "You know, I wrote at Harvard, I have never seen equipment like this. This is fantastic." And so they said for the next half an hour, they stood there talking about nothing but rowing. And everybody else on this committee just standing around, one foot then the other. And on the basis of that, Boeing got the contract for 100 pursuit planes from Boeing. And in the Boeing history, that was the beginning of the ascendancy of Boeing. It was 1921, 1922. The boys realized Boeing wanted them to stay forever, but they wanted to build boats. And they went in and told them, you know, "Thank you very much, but we're going to leave the company. We're going to get back." They didn't have any contracts or anything, but they figured, we're going to build boats. And Boeing said, "I can't thank you enough. You have helped launch this company. I cannot pay you what you're worth." What he paid them with was Boeing stock. This is 1922. The company went public in 1921. And here is a tale of 2 families. My grandfather came east, I'll tell you about that in a minute, and to work for Yale. And he was married. My Uncle Johnny had been born in 1920. He sold the stock and he built a house, a very fine house in Milford, Connecticut, that I knew. George never sold the stock. So they did very well. George never really had to make a lot of money in the boat building business. In fact, his first order for a boat was from Cal, other than University of Washington. He built an 8. He had no idea how much to charge. He cabled a friend of his in London, "How much do you charge for an 8?" And he kind of translated it. So he gave him a price. In 1924, the price of an 8-oared shell was $1,250. In 1960, he sold the same boat for $1,800. Okay, so an increase between 1924 and 1960 of only, what is that, $500 or something like that. He never had to make money, really. And there's a story, UCLA ordered 2 boats, 2 8s, and he called them and said, "Your boats are ready, come pick them up." And they came, and there were 3 8s out there. And they said, "We ordered 2. And he said, "Yeah, you're starting a program. You can't really start with 2. I built you 3. And this was him. And they had many, many stories of building boats and giving them and say, "Pay me when you can." Because George's view was he wanted to promote rowing. He felt rowing was the best way to build character, to build people, to teach them the leadership, the way to life. And in his little blue sticker, if you've ever rowed in a Pocock boat, you know this. It usually says George Pocock, Racing Shells, University Station, Seattle, Washington. For several years, that sticker said, "George Pocock, building boats to build mankind." That was his sticker. And that was his philosophy. So thanks to Boeing, they basically operated for rowing and not as much for profit. 1922, Ed Leader was the coach at Washington. Yale University came west to try to persuade him to come east and coach at Yale. They were successful. Yale had money. Washington didn't have much money to pay the coach. That was one thing. And he had a very distinguished career at Yale. He said, "Okay, I'll come east on one condition, that one of the Pococks come with me." And my grandfather did. And that's how our family got to the east. I grew up in Milford, and we're all centered around New Haven. My grandfather's career for Yale, his contract was to build 1 8-oared shell per year. And it had a non-compete clause. You could not build for any other college. And so and his total output of his career was 42 8s. And George, all his boats were named None of Dick's boats were named. They were just enumerated, Roman numeral 1 through 42. Here is a story that our side of the family always talks to the West Coast family about. Between 1922 and 1927, Yale was undefeated on the river. They were undefeated for 5 years. And all the competitors looked at these great crews, but they looked at the equipment. It was so far superior. Where'd you get that boat? Well, this guy, Dick Pocock, built it. Can you build one? No, I can't. Where can I get one? Well, you can get one in Seattle from my brother George. And that's how, so we say, that's how your business grew. And they actually agree with it. But, you know, Washington would come east every year, and George would carry a clipboard with him. By the end of that whole Poughkeepsie regatta, he had orders from a lot of colleges for boats because they saw this tremendous Pocock equipment. And George took a lot of orders that way. So here is, this is the 1924 gold medal Olympic winning crew from Yale University. My grandfather's in the back row, third from the left. 1924, he is 35 years old. He built, this is boat number 4. And they went over to Paris and they won the gold medal. Interesting, one guy that was in the boat was Benjamin Spock, who later became a baby doctor, wrote the book about babies, Dr. Spock. He was a gold medal winning on this Yale crew. And I got a little show and tell table. We'll probably have to carry that in the lobby. I'll put this here. This is the badge. This is now 100 years old. This is the badge that my grandfather had that, you know, you wore in your lapel that gets you into all these events, and it's got his number on the back and his name, so the Olympiad. I want to go back home with that too. The Summer Olympics are this year, 2024, 100 years later in Paris, right? 100 years after that Olympiad. We got a gold medal winning crew. This is the guy who built every other boat other than Yale for every college. By 1940, every other college was rowing a George Pocock built boat. And you know, the Poughkeepsie Regatta, there were 30 boats in the year 1940 on the river from those colleges. Every single one was George Pocock built. In 1927, he threw away Spanish cedar, which was how he was taught to build a boat. This is Western red cedar. He goes at great lengths in his memoirs about the superiority of Western red cedar. If you've rowed in a Pocock boat, in single or an 8, it's made out of cedar. This is a record. The United States won the gold medal in 8s every single Olympics from 1920 to 1956. That's unbelievable. And it's all of them in Pocock boats, one built by my grandfather, the rest of them built by George. This is it. Other than 1920, the Naval Academy, you know what else is true about this? Every single coach learned how to row at Washington, right? And so this is the legacy of the Pococks, teaching the Thames waterman stroke to these people. And they went, you see Cal won 3 of them, Kai Ebright. And now if you've seen the movie, Kai Ebright is a big guy. He's a coxswain. He was a coxswain at UW. And so they got that wrong. That's one of the 10. The other thing they got wrong was, you know, that it was a powerful scene in the movie about him coming in with the last $300, right, from Cal. Never happened. They raised that money in 2 days. And the way they raised it, there were 2 newspaper people who followed the crew, and they were in Poughkeepsie. Then they went down. You know, the final trials were actually down in Princeton, and they won that sprint race. And they were there, and Ulbrichtson came back and said, "We got to raise 5." They told them between $5,000 and $6,000. And these guys wired their papers home. The next day, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and the Seattle Times headline news about this with a picture of Bobby Mock and Don Hume winning the race. And the 2 newspapers spearheaded the campaign to raise that money. Ulbrichtson called the head of the Chamber of Commerce, who was a big booster, told him the problem. He got busy. By the time the papers went to press the next morning, they had raised $1,700 from businesses. You know, the head of the chamber said, "Okay, I'll promise $500." They called every chamber of commerce in the state of Washington and every American Legion Hall. And University of Washington students went out with the newsboys out on the streets, and they were selling these little pins for 50 cents each. Everybody in Seattle got to raising money. They raised $5,000 in 2 days. So it was never in question, but it was a great moment in the movie. So, right? It's Hollywood. All right, here's the crew, the winning crew. Another thing about the movie, you see they got this nice USA thing, and in the movie they had the USA they wore. They didn't race in their uniforms. In the Berlin Olympics, they raced in ratty t-shirts and some of them were bareback. You know why? Because they're working boys. They didn't want to get those uniforms dirty. And they just, every race they raced in, they just raced in scrubs, they raced in t-shirts. They did come home with the shirts off the backs of the Germans and the Italians. The Brits would not bet. And George Pocock has in his collection, I was talking to my second cousin, Katie Kuski, just yesterday. George was given by the Cox, Don Hume, 3 shirts, the USA, the German with the swastika, and the Italian. And they are now on display in the University of Washington Library. They had a reunion every 10 years. This is 40 years on, and they would take the Husky Clipper down and take it out for a row. You can actually Google, in 1980, they were interviewed, and there's a YouTube interview, and Bobby Mock and Joe Rance and Roger Morris is there, and they talk about the race. So it's pretty cool. All right, the end of the race, the famous, I want to tell you, both the book and the book more than the movie, but not enough on each of them. The race was won. George Pocock told me this, great Uncle George. He said the still water, the flat water underneath those grandstands was good for 10 seconds. He said those grandstands were temporary grandstands built out there, 500 meters, the last quarter of the race. And he said the first 3/4 of the race, terrible wind, terrible chop. Bobby Mock couldn't keep the boat straight. He had to kind of head it in. So, and lanes 1 and 2 were protected. But by the last quarter of the race, lanes 1 and 2 had the wind and the chop. Lane 6 was completely protected. And he said, I believe that was good for 10 seconds. They won by 0.6 of a second. And there wasn't that photo finish, you know, as I said, they announced it within 4 or 5 seconds. But they also got up to 46 strokes a minute. They had never gone faster than 42 strokes a minute. And Bobby Mock actually talks about this too, you know, and they got Don Hume snapping too when he's singing the song to him. That never happened. But he does, and Bobby Mock says that Don Hume was so sick that they were rowing at like 32 in the beginning, and he was calling for him to raise the rate. He said his eyes were clamped shut, his jaw was slacked, his mouth was open for the first 1,000 meters. And Bobby Mock said, okay, I got to do something I've never done before, nobody's ever tried it. I got to get number 7 to pick up the pace, and maybe Bobby will fall in. And he was about to do that. All of a sudden, his eyes opened up, his jaw clamped shut, and he said, give it to me. And then he raised the rate, and they rode over 40 for the last 1,000 meters and sprinted. And they all say, too, that they were, Cox would put out his arm, just one other arm's length would touch this stands, and he said the sound was deafening. 75,000 people yelling Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland in time with the German stroke. And they could not hear, even he's screaming through that megaphone, couldn't hear him. So he had the knockers, and he was, you know, kept pounding the boat. They got up to 46, and they won. This is a picture of the course, so you could see that. That's the protected water that was right there. What's not clear here is on that right side, you see that promontory that comes out, that flattens out. You know, they come right by that. There was a hill there. And where Al Ulbrichtson and George Pocock were standing on a raised thing at the boathouse near the finish line, they really couldn't see the crews until they came around that hillock. Ulbrichtson had a cigarette in his mouth, and his jaw was working up and down on this cigarette. And they'd heard the announcer that the U.S. they say they were down by 4 lengths. No. I mean, if you're down by 4 lengths in a sprint race, it's over. The furthest behind they were was 1.5 lengths. But the announcer had kept saying the U.S. is 5th, the U.S. is 6th. And they come around, and Al Albrechtsen, as soon as they came around the hill, saw that they were in striking distance, you know, that they had touched the boat of, you know, the stern of the German and the Italian crews. And his jaw was going up and down on the cigarette. When they came around, he saw that. He bit the cigarette in half. One half fell out, the other half he swallowed. So George remembered that, wrote that down. Here is the Husky Clipper. It's hanging in the Coney Bear Shell House in University of Washington, public building. You can walk on in, take your picture underneath it too. And if you've rode in a Pocock wind shell, you recognize that. That's just work of art, beautiful woodwork. That is the Husky Clipper when it was in the racks. I put this picture in because you notice it has 7 chevrons in there. You get a chevron on your boat when you win a race. So this was an undefeated boat, won 7 races. In the movie, the boat comes out of the shop with 7 chevrons on it. Another mistake, okay? It comes out of the shop with 0 chevrons on it. That's Joe Rance's letter sweater that's all hanging in that boathouse. That is Joe Rance about a month before he died, holding his gold medal. The story is that he died of heart failure about 2009, I think it was, something like that. And he spent the last several months of his life in Judy Rance, his daughter. He had 5 kids. He and Joyce did marry, 5 kids, and stayed in her home. And she figured that, boy, my dad has all these stories, you know, and she wrote them all down. She typed them up in a 9-page, single-space little thing, and she figures, you know, maybe I'll write this up into a book one day. And her husband said, her name is Judy Rance Willman, husband said, you know, our neighbor there across the field over that fence, Dan Brown, I think he's a writer. Why don't you go check it out with him? So she went over to Daniel James Brown and said, do you think this might be a good book? Could you take a look? 7:30 the next morning, he knocked on her door, said, not only would this be a great book, he said, I urge you to write it. If you don't want to write it, would you permit me to write it? And that's how this book came to be. Judy Rance is the source of the book. She actually shares in the royalty. She's happy. It's just had 4 million sales now, and the movie. And that's Dan Brown. Farthest thing from an oarsman you can imagine. And but he got it right, didn't he? And I thanked him personally. And I wish I had a hanky because I started to cry. I said, you got George Pocock right. You never met the man, but you got him right. And so that was a meeting in Judy's living room. Ready All is a biography of George Pocock, written in '87, republished since that book came out. I got my copy there. You could buy it on Amazon. And this is, I don't know who that guy on the right is, but that's my second cousin, Katie Kuski. This was at the Seattle premiere of the movie on December 7th, and George Clooney is there, and he just loved meeting anybody with Pocock name and Pocock blood. I put this in because this is a picture of George in 1936. The guy who played him was 72 years old. George was 45 at the time. George was tall, full head of hair, and lithe, and this guy was bald and a little bit stocky. He did get him right in the kind of the wisdom, you know, and the reverence and all that, and the poetic nature of rowing, but didn't look like him at all. I just threw this in because Frances always had these pictures. She wrote a whole memoir of the whole Olympics, and a lot of it was on where they went to dinner. And so they were good friends with the Albrechtsens. Those are the Albrechtsens at the back and the Pococks on the right and some other people. It's interesting because her diary of the whole thing was epistolary. She wrote a letter home to her kids every single day. On the race, on the gold medal race, her entry was about this big. It basically said, well, we got off to a slow start, but we won. And that's George on the right, that's the team, and that's the guy that I knew. A reverent, wonderful man, loved by everybody, tremendous wisdom and incredible influence on rowing here in America and throughout the world. All right, so that's it. Where are we on time? 7:34. I'm 4 minutes over time. All right. Yay. We have to clear the place because they got a movie, but I will walk right out there and I'll do questions and answer and talk to any of you as long as you want to stay. And on my, this is a fantastic book by Stan Pocock, who is George's son. George's book is called Ready All. This is called Way Enough, My Life in Rowing. There is another book about the Berlin Olympics, about the rowing in the Berlin Olympics. Michael Sokolow, he's at University of Maine. This is a very good book called 6 Minutes in Berlin. And I have a whole bunch of pictures from the first years of the Boeing company. These are original photographs that have been in our family, and these are really interesting. So a lot of airplanes and pontoons.
Thank you, Jim. Do we have Stonington crew? Hold on just a sec, folks. Ethan and Rowan? All right, can you guys take the table out for us? I know you did steady state today, so you can handle it.
No, I got it.
And before you go, we have something for Jim. Thank you very much for coming. We have a 25th anniversary Stonington Crew shirt.
All right. There it is.
Compared to your family history in rowing, that's just a blip in time, but it's a big deal for us.
I'll wear it with pride.
Thank you.